Good morning. My name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, or NUMOA, and I want to welcome all of you to this morning's webinar on RCRA compliance at cleanup sites. We're going to focus on area of contamination and contamination in environmental media. We're going to start the webinar in a minute or so. Some people are still joining, so I want to give them an opportunity to join. So just hang tight for about a minute or so and we'll get started. While we're waiting as people join us, I'm going to review some webinar logistics for folks. So during the presentation, we're going to keep everyone muted so there's no audio background distraction noises. And if you need to communicate with me as the moderator, you can use on your control panel, there's a little, in mine it's towards the bottom, something called chat. You can click on that and type a message in the chat box, and I will try to respond. I'm going to be monitoring that throughout the presentation. If you want to, and you can chat with other participants in the webinar, although you may not know who the other participants are, but you might want to be clear about who you're directing your message to when you use the chat feature. Also, there's a question box, and that's a useful feature to use if you want to pose a question. So during the presentation, you can post questions there so that you don't forget your questions. And at the end, I will review as many of those questions as I possibly can. I'll moderate them. Any questions that are similar, I'll bundle them together. So we will be doing that at the very end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting a recording of the webinar on our website, and I will show at the end of the webinar where you can find the materials. We will also be posting all of the slides from this morning's webinar. We do value your feedback, and we ask that you take the post-webinar survey and give us feedback on this presentation this morning. So we still have some folks joining. I'm going to give it another minute and then we'll get started. So good morning, everyone. As I said a few minutes ago, my name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, and I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar on RCRA compliance at cleanup sites. This is the second webinar we're doing in a series of 4 on issues we think are important for anyone involved in a cleanup site to know about RCRA compliance. Today we're going to talk about how to understand the area of contamination and contamination of environmental media as it relates to RCRA compliance. We are privileged today to have Mark Dennen from the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Office of Waste Management. He's a supervising environmental scientist. He is a certified professional geologist with a master's degree from the University of Oklahoma. His degrees in geology. Following his work as a consultant, he began working at the Rhode Island DEM in 1989. He is responsible for oversight of programs for the solid waste, hazardous waste, and medical waste areas. Outside of work, he is an associate professor of geology at the Community College of Rhode Island, and he also teaches martial arts and meditation. And I think the meditation comes in particularly helpful when you're doing a webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. If you have any problems with the webinar this morning, please send me a message through the chat feature. If you have any questions as the presentation goes on, please post them in the question box, and I will be monitoring those, and we will get to your questions at the end of the presentation. Hopefully we'll have somewhere around 20 minutes or a half an hour for questions and answers. So thank you, Mark. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. Before I start, I'd mention that much of my career, I was in the Superfund and site remediation program. So I understand how annoying people in the RCRA program can be to people in the site remediation program, knowing that most of my audience is from site remediation. So today we're going to talk about area of contamination and contamination environmental media. But I do want to just, Ross Bonnell gave a presentation last month from Connecticut EP. He gave an excellent presentation on characterization of your waste under RCRA. And I just wanted to highlight a few things from that presentation because they really are important here. So the first and most important thing I want to re-emphasize that he emphasized was that generators are responsible to fully and properly characterize their waste. This is the responsibility of the generator. It can never be delegated to anybody else. You can get an opinion from your transporter, your disposal facility, consultants, state agencies, whatever, but the determination always rests with the generator. And if the waste is hazardous waste, it has to be managed in accordance with hazardous waste requirements. That's not when the waste, when you finally finish your characterization, is from the time that the waste is generated. So you may have periods of time where you manage your waste as if it's RCRA, if it may be a RCRA hazardous waste. The other thing is, often with site remediation sites, we have the concept of co-generators, that each of them is jointly and severally liable for compliance. So you may have a property owner, and you may have an operator who's different than the property owner, who, say, leased the property. Then you may have the person who does the remediation, the consultant or the contractor that comes in and manages the waste in the course of the remediation. So all of these people can be considered to be generators and can be held responsible for compliance issues under RCRA. So it's really important to figure out ahead of time before you try to deal with areas of contamination and contamination environmental media. Is your site regulated under RCRA? And basically, if the hazardous waste was regulated, was listed after 1980, then it is regulated. So when you deal with waste at the site, let's say you excavate soil out of the ground, you need to figure out whether or not it's regulated. So there's three ways something can become a hazardous waste. It can exhibit a hazardous waste characteristic, such as ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity. So you can test it. It can be hazardous waste because it contains a listed hazardous waste, let's say spent TCE solvent. This is based on the origin of the material. It's not based on any laboratory tests, so it requires knowledge of the process that generated the material. And lastly, it may be a state-specific waste, so it may not meet any of the definitions under federal RCRA, but your state may regulate it as a hazardous waste. An example of that would be in Rhode Island, PCB waste is regulated as a hazardous waste. The other thing I want to mention is when you look at a waste, you not only need to determine if it's a hazardous waste in the state it's being generated, but in the state it's going to. Because often we cross state boundaries in the course of managing our contaminated materials. So if it's a hazardous waste in New Hampshire, but not Rhode Island, and it's going to New Hampshire, you need to figure that out ahead of time. So your determination can be based on two things, analysis and process knowledge. So the less you know about the process, the more analysis you may need to make. And the soil and groundwater are subject to determination, whether they're a hazardous waste or a solid waste, when you dig them up. So when you've got material in the ground, you're in the site remediation universe. But once you dig it up, it becomes a solid waste, and if it meets any of those definitions, it becomes a hazardous waste. Many states, like Rhode Island, and I'll speak a lot about from Rhode Island's point of view, but we have policies that allow you to do exploratory test pitting and put the waste immediately back without considering it to be a solid waste. But if you remove waste, stockpile waste, let's say you pull a tank, you stockpile the waste, you have to manage it under RCRA if it's a RCRA hazardous waste. And you may not know right away if it is a hazardous waste because you haven't gotten laboratory confirmatory analysis. So you may need to manage that material as if it is a RCRA hazardous waste in case it fails. So the concept of listed versus characteristic hazardous waste is going to become very important when we're talking about environmental media. So again, I just want to review some of the issues Ross pointed out in his presentation. A lot of times you don't know what the source of the contamination was. And what the regulations require you to do is to make a good faith effort to determine what the source was. Because let's say it's a spent solvent, then it would be regulated. So you're trying to figure out if there was a dry cleaner on the site or somebody who did degreasing, whatever, that you try to review all the documentation that you can. If the documentation is inconclusive or not available, you don't have to assume that it is a listed waste, but you have to make every attempt to determine whether or not it's listed. Similarly, you need to know what the source is. You also need to know when the contamination happened, because listing only applies after the waste was listed, which is usually November 1980. But it's a similar approach. You make a good faith effort to determine when the waste was released. If you can't come up with reasonable documentation, then you don't have to assume that it is listed. So you're going to look at things like manifest, inspection reports, company records, interview former employees, and we would consider a good faith effort to be a sincere attempt to find all of these bits of data. So, say you have a listed hazardous waste. There are some things that are important to remember about listed hazardous waste. With characteristic hazardous waste, if you were to excavate the soil would only be characteristic hazardous waste if it exhibited that characteristic. So let's say you had, there was some small amount of ignitable waste, but when you test the soil, it doesn't fail for ignitability. You don't have to consider that a D001 waste. But with listed hazardous waste, in theory, one molecule of listed hazardous waste in 100,000 cubic yards of soil gives you 100,000 cubic yards of listed hazardous waste. So dilution is definitely not the solution of pollution in this case. Once it's a listed hazardous waste, it's subject to the landfill disposal requirements, including LDR treatment standards. And these standards may be performance-based. You have to get down to a certain concentration, or they may be technology-based. You have to do, say, incineration. There are certain approved technologies. To treat hazardous waste on-site, you may need a permit under corrective action, authorization under corrective action. So we're going to talk about when you might and might not need that. So as a general rule, in order to treat a hazardous waste, you have to do that treatment under a RCRA permit. but there are some important exceptions. And these exceptions include treatment of waste that has been contained out, and this is something, contamination in environmental media, that we will talk about in depth. The other thing we'll talk about in depth is treatment in accordance with the area of contamination policy. So this is, in the first case, the contained out determination is how you can determine that media contaminated with listed hazardous waste is no longer a hazardous waste. With the area of contamination policy, these are things that you can do within an area of contamination and not yet consider it to be generated. There are certain allowances for generators to treat waste in tanks and containers. This is often very state specific, especially in the Northeast, so check with your state. You can treat RCRA waste in wastewater treatment units that are permitted by the Clean Water Act. There is an exemption. That would be things like elementary neutralization. And you, under RCRA corrective action, you can treat and authorize corrective action management units or treatment units. And there's a process in corrective action to be authorized to do that treatment on site. So, other than RCRA, there may be other permits that you need. For instance, if you're treating non-hazardous media, you may require a state permit. An example of that might be a mobile soil treatment facility. Also, you may trip the need for permitting under your air or water or even solid waste programs. Examples might be if you did soil venting, then you're going to have some discharge to the air, so you have to meet air standards. Groundwater pump and treat systems, after you pump and treat the water, what are you going to do with it? If you re-inject it, you may fall under underground injection control program in your state. If you discharge it to a surface water body, then you may fall under the, in Rhode Island it would be the RIPDES program, the Clean Water Act Surface Discharge Permit, or you may discharge it to a sewer, in which case you fall under you may need a wastewater discharge permit. So there's other things to be aware of in addition to the RCRA regulations. So first I want to talk about the area of contamination policy. So this is certain activities that you can do within the area of contamination. This policy is supported by most of the NUMOA states, if not all the NUMOA states. The area of contamination, this is important to remember, it's a single contiguous area of continuous contamination. So in that little sketch down below, you see an area of contaminated soil. The policy allows certain activities to occur within the area of contamination without actually considering it to be, quote, generated. So if it's not generated, the other RCRA treatment requirements don't fall in. So you could do consolidation of waste within that area of contamination, and you can do in situ treatment of waste within the area of contamination. But you cannot move the waste outside of the area of contamination, or now you've triggered the RCRA requirements, and you cannot move waste between areas of contamination. So, and by ex situ treatment would be an example of moving it outside of the area of contamination. So, I've got a simple sketch here just showing what I mean. We have two areas of contamination, Area 1 and Area 2. Let's say we've defined this with superficial soil samples. If you wanted to, say, do movement of soil to, let's look at Area 2 down at the bottom. If you had a little treatment pile A, you want to move soil into that treatment pile, that's perfectly allowed. If you wanted to stockpile soil within Area 2, that's also allowed. Maybe you want to stockpile it for movement off-site. That's okay. But let's say you wanted to move it over to this treatment pile B here on the right. Maybe that's a better area for you to mobilize or a better area for you to do your treatment. That's not allowed because you're moving it outside of the dirty area into the clean area. I should say it's not allowed under the area of contamination policy. Also, you couldn't take soils from Area 1 and bring them to Area 2. That is also not allowed. However, important to remember, the area of contamination, first of all, is not dependent on property boundaries. It's dependent on where the contamination is. And the second is, it's not just based on contamination on the surface. It's based on the overall contamination, both at surface and at depth. So I'm going to show you a hypothetical cross-section of the area I just showed you. Well, in the surface, Area 1 and Area 2 seem to be very distinct with a clean zone in between. But at depth, the contamination interfingers, so there isn't really a clean zone between the two. And those of you that do site remediation know that very distinct, discrete areas of contamination with completely clean zones in between is probably not the situation we encounter most of the time. So if we know, and it obviously is a very simple sketch that life is never that simple, but if we know that the contamination fingers together from Area 1 and Area 2, then we can draw our area of contamination boundary as shown here. So if we could define the area of contamination more broadly based on where all of the contamination is, then now all of a sudden treatment pile B, where that wasn't allowed, it is allowed now, because looking at the big picture, it is within the area of contamination. So the area of contamination isn't just the hot spot. It's all the areas that are contaminated. You may have very highly contaminated area in Area 1 and in Area 2, but you may have mildly contaminated soils in other places. And if you define your area of contamination as the overall area, it gives you more flexibility, and that's allowed. So a treatment of waste outside of the area of contamination requires a RCRA permit. And there are mechanisms by which you can get that authorization. You can have staging piles to temporarily store materials. You can have temporary units. This temporary units kind of resembles in RCRA treatment in tanks and containers, but they're basically mobile units that you're going to, non-land-based units that you're going to operate for a limited period of time. And finally, probably the highest level of permitting under corrective action would be corrective action management units. We call these CAMUs. You can have CAMUs that are disposal CAMUs. That's more like a landfill, a lot like a landfill. Or you can have treatment CAMUs, remediation units that are land-based, like say a reactive slurry wall. Okay, so, I'm sorry, having a little glitch here. There. So a disposal CAMU, and I've made a typo there, I just realized, it says comma. So this is going to require the things that a hazardous waste landfill might require: a cap, a liner, a leachate collection system. Treatment and storage CAMUs, these occur over a more limited time. If it's going to be more than 2.5 years, then you basically need to build it like you would build a disposal CAMU. And the consolidation of waste within that CAMU might not trigger LDRs as well. So that is basically, in a nutshell, the area of contamination policy. So these other things, CAMUs, treatment units, they require a higher level of corrective action authorization. In many states, like Rhode Island, the corrective action authorization works hand in hand with the site remediation program to allow those permits to go forward in a lot less burdensome way than getting a full-blown RCRA Part B treatment storage disposal facility permit. The notifications are often wrapped up into the notification requirements of the site mediation program. So if the site mediation program required a notification, say notification but not a public hearing, but the RCRA required notification and a public hearing, you would just do one notification, one public hearing to cover the site. Okay, we'll take a deep breath now and we'll talk about the contained in policy. So the area of contamination policy allowed us to get out of some of the RCRA requirements with what we managed within the area of contamination. The idea there was not to spread contamination. Contained in policy is more relevant for environmental media. So soil, sediment, groundwater that's been contaminated with a listed hazardous waste. Why is listed hazardous waste the only one that's important? Because we talked about with characteristic hazardous waste, you do the test, and if it exhibits the characteristic, it's hazardous. If it's flammable, it's flammable. If it flunks T-clip, it flunks T-clip. With contained in policy, this is really geared more towards listed hazardous waste, because as you know, just a little bit of listed hazardous waste makes the whole thing a hazardous waste. But this becomes unworkable if you had an aquifer that's contaminated with TCE and you consider the entire aquifer to be a RCRA hazardous waste. The states are allowed to make contained out determinations for environmental media that allow it to not be considered to contain a listed hazardous waste anymore. This determination, this contained out determination, people sometimes will call it a contained in determination, but it's based on health-based standards promulgated by the states. So saying, okay, this water has TCE in it, but it has TCE in it below the drinking water standard. It's safe to drink, not appropriate to consider this a hazardous waste anymore. All the NMOA states have established these health-based criteria that they can use for contained out determinations. Many of the NMOA states do require, and we do require, and I think all of my neighbors do as well, a formal approval of the contained out determination prior to disposal in their state. So a lot of you are used to a lot of the site mediation functions in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts being delegated to licensed site professionals. Often this is something that's not delegated and has to come from the state, this determination. As I say, it can apply to soil, it can apply to groundwater, or it can apply to sediment. It can apply to any environmental media. So I'm going to use the example just to go through this process of TCE in soil. So let's say we have a soil that is at 8 milligrams per kilogram. TCE in a soil that's at 8 milligrams per kilogram. Now, we're used to milligrams per kilogram total. We do totals in the site mediation world. So if we're trying to compare it to RCRA standards, we need to convert total metals, total TCE, to TCLP, which is milligram per liter. So we take this number and we divide by 20. Dividing by 20 is not assuming some proportion of it is soluble. It's assuming it's all leachable, and this is just a conversion of units. So that gives us 0.4 milligram per liter in T-clip. Now, obviously, you could do the T-clip and just get milligram per liter, but often you're dealing with totals. So you need to estimate here. Now, the RCRA regulatory level, to make it a D040 hazardous waste, is 0.5 milligram per liter. So we're below the level that makes it a characteristic hazardous waste. So it's not characteristic. Now we get into, we have to ask ourselves whether it's listed. So let's say you had a dry cleaner there. Dry cleaner used TCE. If they closed before 1979, then listing doesn't apply. But let's say they operated from 1982 to 88. So you have a pretty good idea that this was TCE, it's a spent solvent, it's an F002. So now we have a listed hazardous waste that doesn't flunk characteristics. So what do? We go to the state. We're trying to get a contained out determination. When you're looking at contained out determination, the state's going to look at its health-based standards, and our site remediation standards are those health-based standards. So what do we have? The RCRA direct exposure standard for residential soils is 12 milligram per kilogram. Industrial commercial standard is 110. The leachability standard is 0.2 milligram per kilogram. That's for GA areas. GA areas in our state are groundwater that's presumed to meet drinking water standards. So this is the level at which it would not leach enough to cause an exceedance of those standards that we've calculated based on a lot of assumptions. And then we also have a GB leachability standard, which is for non-drinking water areas that are presumed to be degraded, and that would be 20. So whether or not we're compliant with those standards depends on where we are. Let's say we had soil at a really low level, 0.1 milligram per kilogram. It's below the residential standard. It's below the GA leachability standard. This is pretty easy to get a contained out determination from us. And we're going to say it's not a RCRA hazardous waste, and without any more caveats, then obviously it's based on the information that was presented to us. But it can stay on site, it can go off site, it's not regulated. Now, in the example that we had, 8 milligram per kilogram, a little more complicated because it is below the residential standard, but it's above the GA leachability standard, below the GB leachability standard. Okay, so we could give you a contained out determination, but it would be based on what's going to happen to that material. If it were going to be reused at the site, and the site was in a GB area, that might be okay. But if it was in a GA area, it would not be. Similarly, if it's going to go somewhere, like, for instance, grading and shaping material at a landfill, then we need to know that that landfill permit allows it to accept the material. So in a lot of cases, we'll let it go as grading and shaping material to a landfill. If that landfill's out of state, we may need some documentation that their permit allows them to take waste at that level. Now, let's say you were above standard, you're above the industrial commercial standard at 525 milligram per kilogram. You're not going to get a contained out determination because that's saying it's not really, it doesn't meet the health-based standards. It's still a threat and still should be considered hazardous waste, and you need to do some treatment of that material. Okay. Now, how you manage it, we talked before about the area of contamination, and how you manage within the area of contamination could affect the standards that you need to meet. So the remediation goal is usually linked towards those state cleanup standards. So let's say you have a GB area, so your cleanup standard is 20 milligram per kilogram. For contaminated soil, we talked about when landfill disposal restrictions kick in, when you've gone outside the area of contamination. This is important because the LDR standard for contaminated soil is 90% reduction capped at 10 times the universal treatment standard. So the universal treatment standard under RCRA for TCE is 6 milligram per kilogram. So let's say your soil is contaminated at 30 milligram per kilogram. Now your site remediation number is 20, but your LDR treatment standard, 90% reduction, would be 3. So it would be quite a bit lower than what the remediation standard is if the LDR were applicable. And this is where if you manage it under an area of contamination, then you're only subject you're subject to the site remediation requirements, not the LDR. So if you were doing an in situ treatment, you only have to hit that 20 milligram per kilogram. But if you take it outside the area of contamination and you do treatment, you may need to treat it down to the much lower level. So just a little summary here, what standards apply, and I'm using Rhode Island as an example. If the contaminant levels in the soil are below residential standard, it is pretty easy for us to, and the appropriate groundwater standards, pretty easy for us to say, obviously no treatment is needed. It's so dilute, it is not a problem. It doesn't matter where it came from. We're going to give you a contained out determination. If it's above industrial commercial standards, it's pretty clear that you're not going to get it. And it's in those cases where it's in between residential and industrial commercial that the determination really depends on what you're going to do with it and where it's going to go. If you're going to exceed residential standards, we require that the property have a deed restriction, an environmental land use restriction that prevents excavation, or also that prevents the location of residences onto that property. As we all know that things like zoning can always be changed. So we have a deed restriction that says you can't put schools, you can't put houses on that site without the department's written permission. Solid waste landfill is easy because they all have that ELUR. It's also the materials under a cap. So we go through a similar process with groundwater, surface water, sediments, trying to figure out if it meets that health-based standard. In terms of these determinations, I just want to emphasize timing is really important because this contained out or contained in determination, if it's performed before the waste is, quote, generated. So if you characterize your site well enough that you can say, we need a contained out determination, and you come to us with your sampling data, and obviously we're going to work very closely with our site remediation section, and in terms of feeling good that you have taken an appropriate number of samples in the right place. But let's say you come to us and you say, these are the levels that we're dealing with, and we give you a contained out determination. If we can give you that before you dug the material up, then it never was a hazardous waste. If you dug the material up and stockpiled it, and then went through the process of asking us for a contained out determination and justifying that you deserve it, you might get that contained out determination, but you would have to be RCRA compliant from the point that you dug it up till the point that we gave you a determination. So until we make that determination, it is still considered a hazardous waste. And in a future webinar, we're going to talk more about LDRs. So again, LDRs, landfill disposal restrictions, come into play and are very important with these contained out determination issues. I'm just giving an example of a site where we had a contained out determination. This was a plating facility in Providence. Now you can see from that sketch that you clearly have, if you look in red, the highly contaminated areas, you clearly have two sources. But in this case, and you have contamination that goes across property boundaries. So yes, you have two sources, but the entire site was considered an area of contamination because this is the TCE plume. You also had cyanide contamination. You had some metals. The location of these hotspots was also important for letting us determine when the waste was released. When we looked at the footprint of the building, you can see there's a TCE degreasing area right next to one of the hotspots. So you have pretty good information here that it was a listed hazardous waste. You have good information that you have two sources, but your property is pretty much the entire property has contamination of some kind, and your contamination goes beyond the definition of that one property boundary. So it did go on to other properties that were also under the control of the generator in this case. So they came to us and asked for a contained out determination. The soil all met industrial commercial standards. So I shouldn't say it all met. In those hotspots, there was some material that didn't meet the industrial commercial standard. It was not appropriate for contained out determination. So we said the soil that they stockpiled into two piles, and one was an 80 cubic yards of material that, in this case, failed TCLP and had to be disposed of at a licensed hazardous waste disposal facility. Then you had a larger pile, 120 cubic yards, moderately impacted soils. They were below TCLP. They were below the GB leachability, but they were above the GA, and they were above residential. So they're below industrial commercial, they're below GB, but they're above GA, and they're above residential. So this would be a good example of something that could get a contained out determination based on where it was going. And where it was going was alternate daily cover at the state's landfill. So it would ultimately be under a cap, met the GB standard, met industrial commercial standards. So that was given a contained out determination. So it didn't get them out of all of the cost of cleanup and disposal as hazardous waste, but it cut it by less than half, by more than half, cut it by more than half. Okay, so just to give some broader examples, if soil is excavated and placed in a pile outside the area of contamination, but you didn't know it was hazardous, and then you discover that it's hazardous when the samples come back, now you're dealing with inadvertently violating the RCRA requirements if you didn't containerize it appropriately. You got a soil with a listed solvents that's excavated and placed on roll-offs and given a contain out determination. It didn't meet LDRs. Well, the contained out determination makes the LDRs no longer applicable. Another example might be it's other kind of medium in addition to soil. In the case like woodblock flooring, it wasn't discovered to be contaminated until it was removed, and then it was staged in outdoor piles. Well, that's a good case a good example of a case where it would be much better to characterize it before you start to manage it. Okay. So, and this is something we've talked about before, that you need to make site characterization and how you're going to deal with areas of contamination and contained in environmental media. You need to think about that before you start doing work at the site. We all worry about cleanup and think we'll characterize it once we get it all stockpiled. But that's probably not the best way to think, because the law of unintended consequences is going to kick in. You could be subject to enforcement actions. You might find that suddenly you need permits for corrective action management unit, that sort of thing, and it's going to impact your overall project schedule. And of course, we all know about delays and cost overruns. So, I'm sorry. There. So you can miss opportunities to minimize your disposal cost. And we talked about the contained in determination, not just getting it, but the timing of it is critical. Contaminated soil management and staging, and in situ versus ex situ treatment. There are some important considerations in terms of what standard you have to meet when you're treating in situ versus ex situ. So what we'd recommend is have a RCRA expert included in your project design from the start, whether you have an in-house expert or whether you contract out. So I'm putting some links for more information. EPA has some good resources. There's a discussion here of the area of contamination policy, and I would also highly recommend EPA's corrective action training module. Actually, all the RCRA training modules are really good, and they're concise and they're accurate. So if you get a chance, check that out. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Mark. This is Terry Goldberg again from NMOA, and we do have some questions for you, so I'm going to start to go through them. The first question from Tammy Caligandes, who's from New Hampshire. She's asking, can you clarify slide 6, bullet 1? And I might attempt to unmute Tammy so she can respond as you talk, but she's slide 6, bullet 1. Tammy, are you unmuted?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you. Go ahead,
Okay,
Mark.
Zach's going to talk for us.
I just wanted to, the first time listed is mentioned, I think that should be characteristic. I just wanted to make sure that my interpretation is right on that.
Oh, you know, you are absolutely correct. Soil is only a characteristic hazardous waste. Thank you for correcting that. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to follow up with, Tammy, or whoever spoke with you?
I think we're all set.
Okay, so I'm going to mute you again. So the next question
I think it's to raise it.
is from Sam Van Duzen. The date of the listing doesn't matter. The listings apply retroactively for the purposes of remediation as long as the waste comes from the listing source. It doesn't matter how old it is. I think this is Sam giving you some kind of clarification. Maybe I can unmute Sam as well. Go ahead, Mark. Do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So the thing about the site remediation versus RCRA. So the site remediation requirement. I'm sorry?
Go ahead. I just unmuted Sam. I think you heard that. Go ahead.
Sam, did you want to clarify your question, or you want me to go ahead and answer it? Sam, are you unmuted?
Sam, you should be unmuted. Sam Van Duzen.
Yeah, I know.
Hello? Well, go ahead, Mark.
Okay. So site remediation requirements, like Superfund as well, are retroactive. It doesn't matter when the contamination occurred. There's a hazardous. There's a hazardous substance in the site, and it doesn't matter where it came from or when it came from. You have to meet the requirements of the site remediation or the Superfund program. With RCRA, timing is everything. In terms of listed waste, that doesn't matter. If you excavate a soil and it flunks TCLP for lead, then it's a lead contaminated hazardous waste, D008. But with the listing is not retroactive. So if an F002 waste was released it was generated in 1965 and it was released in 1965, it's not a listed hazardous waste. In order to be a listed hazardous waste, it needs to have been generated after the listing. In most cases, that's November 19th, 1980. There are a couple of other listings occurred, I think, in 82. But it has to be generated after the listing. And if you don't know whether or not it's generated, and check with your state on this, because some states could say differently, but most of us say, if you can't tell after a good faith effort when it was generated, then you don't have to assume it was generated after 90, and you don't have to treat it as a listed hazardous waste. It still may be regulated in other ways, but the listing only applies if it was listed at the time it was generated. And if anyone,
So I'm going to try to unmute Sam again and see if they can talk and see if they want to add any questions or comments. Sam?
sorry, did I say 1990 instead of 1980? I meant to say 1980. If I did say 90, I apologize.
Sam, do you have anything you want to follow up with on this?
Oh my God. Yeah.
Hello? I think the audio is not very good for some reason.
57 Federal Register 37284.
Wait, 50 FR. Wait, 50,
57.
wait,
57 FR.
wait, 57 FR?
57 FR.
Right,
37284.
37284.
Um,
31298.
And
Mark, I'm going to unmute them. I'm not sure what they're doing.
7.
Looks like they're looking something up.
298. August.
Okay, Mark, I'm going to go to the next question.
Okay.
This is from, we have a couple questions from Tamara Scholten. Tamara asks, if you stockpile within an area of contamination for later treatment, what date is it considered generated? The date excavated, or the date moved from the area of contamination? That's her first question.
It's a very good question. I believe it's the date that it was excavated, but the standards that allow you to manage it within the area of contamination are applicable then. So the requirement to manage it in accordance with other aspects of RCRA outside the area of contamination, I think they would only apply when you moved it outside of the area of contamination. But the generation took place when you dug it up. Well, it was managed within the area of contamination. Yeah, I think your standards are going to kick in when you take it outside the area of contamination, because you're allowed to move soils without having it be considered generated within the AOC.
Okay, Mark, just some advice. Maybe go back to the slide that you show your contact information
Sure.
at the end and pull that up. Okay, another question from Tamara, and I will try to unmute Tamara after I go through these questions. So her question is, are RCRA permits for treatment required if the treatment is a CERCLA remedial action?
If the remedial action occurs under CERCLA, so in other words, it's a Superfund site.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes,
Tamara?
that's the question. Are RCRA permits for treatment required if the treatment is a CERCLA remedial action? CERCLA being Superfund, yes.
Under CERCLA, you have because it's a yes and a no. Under CERCLA, you have an exemption that exempts you from the administrative requirements of laws, of regulations, so for on-site activities. So assuming you're doing it on-site, you don't have to get the actual permit. However, CERCLA does require that you obey all of the substantive requirements of the regulations. So it would say you don't need a permit, but you need to comply with what all the permit conditions would have been. Does that make sense? Now, if you do treatment off-site in CERCLA, then you need to get a permit as well as to obey the permit requirements. So if you had treatment and discharge onto a water body that was within the CERCLA site, that you might not need a NIPDES or RIPDES permit, but you would need to meet the standards that you would need to meet to get a RIPDES permit for, say, discharge of lead. But if you discharge the water off-site, then you would need to get a RIPDES permit as well as meeting those standards.
So, Mark, there's a follow-up question. If your state is a federal RCRA state, I assume that means RCRA authorized state, what is the federal health-based standard used for contained in policy? Is it EPA RSLs, restricted substances list?
No, it is the state's health-based standard. is the standard that's used for contained out if you're in a RCRA authorized state.
So she's talking about contained in.
Right. So the contained in determination
Mm-hmm.
is made in accordance with the state's health-based standards, not the federal health-based standards, because the state is the one who makes that determination.
Okay, the final question I think that she's posed is, if contamination of the soils with a listed hazardous waste occurred prior to the 1980 date, is it still a hazardous waste if it is excavated?
Only if it flunks characteristic, not based on listing. It's not hazardous based on listing. Only hazardous.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Tamara and see if she has any other responses or questions. Tamara, you're unmuted now. Do you have
Can you
any
hear me?
follow-up? Yeah.
Yes, I meant with the non-federal authorized states. So if it is a Fed RCRA, what are the health-based standards used for the contained in determination?
The contained in policy allows states to do it, and I'm not sure that EPA in a non-RCRA delegated state would make a contained out determination. I'm not aware of a time that they've done it. I'm trying to think of which NMOA states are not RCRA authorized. Do we have any NMOA states that are not RCRA? I don't think we do.
Well, I'm in Alaska, and
Okay.
the document I'm looking at is EPA's management of remediation waste under RCRA, where it discusses the contained in policy, and it says that EPA does have to approve that determination that you make. So I was just wondering that.
I'm sorry that I don't have a good answer for you. I'm not sure what the standard that EPA uses in an example where a state's not RCRA authorized.
Okay. My next question, I wanted to just clarify a little bit, and I think it was the same as Sam's question. The other training that we had stated that if it was a listed hazardous waste that was spilled or released prior to 1980, as long as it stayed in place, it was not a hazardous waste. But according to that training, it said once you do excavate it, then you are generating it, and therefore it is a listed hazardous.
I think I didn't mean to imply that if I implied that. If it was never, it was released before listing. The listing is not applied to it even when you generated it, because you didn't generate, and here's the difference. Let's say you had TCE released from a tank. The TCE was generated when it became waste TCE, and then it was in a tank and it was not properly characterized. The TCE is the listed waste, and the activity that generated it was its use as a spent solvent. Now, so let's say that happened in the 70s, and then you dig up the waste. You don't generate the waste till you dig it up. Your activity of digging up the waste is not an activity that subjects it to listing. So if the original listing of the TCE is not valid because of the time that it was generated, then you generated it only by digging it up. And the only thing that would be relevant in terms of making a determination is whether or not it fails characteristic or it's a state hazardous waste. So the listing would not apply because the activity of generating it was when the activity of originally generating the TCE. Does that make sense?
Well, it is different than the training that we had prior. That's why
we can send out. I will get together with Russ Bonnell, and we can send out a clarification to make sure that there's no conflict between what we're saying.
I would appreciate that because it is a critical aspect to this whole.
I realize it's critical, and therefore that's why I would make sure that what we send out would be both from me and Russ, so we can agree that this is the answer. So if you want to, well, you probably already, you've already asked the question in writing, so I can get together with Russ and we can send that out. Right, Terry? We can email that out as a follow-up?
We can, yes, we do. If, for people who registered for the webinar, all of you, we have your email addresses, so we can send out a follow-up to this, to the webinar. Thank you, Mark. Mark, can you full screen your slide, just make it easier to see?
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah. All right, so the next question, Tamar, did you have anything else you wanted to ask while you're unmuted?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's pretty early where you are.
Very early.
Yeah.
And if anyone else thinks about an issue they want clarification on, you can email me. And we can.
Okay, so
you feel,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, anything else that you feel unsure of, or you feel like there's a conflict in something you've been told, either at a previous seminar or you've been told at some previous training, and you want to get this clear in writing to make sure that you understand it, please don't hesitate to call me. And I'll be happy to not only answer you, but run it by some of my colleagues in other states so that we can ensure it's not just my opinion.
Okay, Mark, the next question is coming from Howard Bunch. It's sort of a similar question. I thought if the source of the contamination would have met the listing criteria, even if the generation occurred before the listing date, so I think he thought, I think that's a sentence. For example, dioxin contaminated soils where disposal was in the 1970s.
If listing is not retroactive, so a listed hazardous waste cannot be generated prior to the listing. It may be that your site remediation standards may require the cleanup of dioxin, but it's not subject to listing, because listing is not retroactive. RCRA is not retroactive.
All right, I'm going to unmute Howard and see if he wants to follow up with anything. Howard?
Yeah, I'm an attorney in Region 7, a federal attorney, so I work for the feds. I've been doing RCRA for 30 years, had dozens of corrective action orders dealing with historical contamination, familiar with RCRA Online, the RCRA Management of Contaminated Soils Guidance, all that. We've always taken the position that when the soil is excavated and needs to be managed, you do the waste determination based on the source, not on the date of the listing. And if the source met the listing criteria, like in my site, Agent Orange was produced through the 70s at a site, and they're excavating soil. And so we're saying, since we know the source, it meets the FO27 listing. And that's been, vetted through opposing counsel, through references in our federal registers and in our federal guidance. So I understand the logic of what Mark is saying, but it's just 100% inconsistent with what I've been doing for the last 25 years and what our guidance document says.
Yeah,
so
and
I would
very,
like to get some clarification.
Yeah, and we'll try to get that. It's inconsistent with the Richter corrective action training that EPA offered in 2009 as well, and inconsistent with their training materials, and inconsistent with what I understand. So we'd be happy to talk with you more to clarify that.
Yeah, it's a big policy issue because that certainly goes to management standards, cost of management of the soils. We're working hard to develop contained out approach for this facility to help them try to mitigate their costs. But, the contamination occurred pre-listing. And so I was focusing in on not a bright line, that if the contamination was pre-listing, I was looking at this from how to evaluate the media from the contained out perspective.
Because then you're dramatically increasing the cost if you consider it to be all listed. even though it was generated pre-RCRA. I'm
Well,
absolutely 100% of the opinion that it's not listed. The listing doesn't apply. But
So,
Okay.
Mark, I'm going to unmute Ross. He's trying to chime in here.
thank you.
Ross, can you? I think I've done it. I've unmuted Kevin. Ross, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Rob.
Yes. Mark, this is something you and I discussed at the NMO meeting back in June. And if you remember, I don't know, everybody gets lots of emails and they get lost in the landslide sometimes. But I sent you a copy of a Federal Register notice. I don't have the exact date for it right now, but I think the person that was on the line before that we were having a hard time hearing was trying to cite that CFR. And in the presentation I gave last month, I have a reference to that CFR in that presentation.
Okay.
And that CFR, not CFR, excuse me, Federal Register notice is unequivocal in EPA's position that listings are retroactive. I don't think there's any significant doubt about that anywhere. What I think there is confusion over is what that means. So what I would like to point out, and I talked about this in the last presentation, but what retroactivity of the listing means is that if you have a waste that was disposed of, spilled or put in the ground or released or what have you, prior to the effective date of the listing for that waste, as it sits in the ground, it is not a listed hazardous waste, okay? But as soon as I like to say you pick it up, the official term for it, by the way, is actively managed. Once you actively manage that contaminated soil containing that listed hazardous waste, it becomes generated, and it not only becomes generated as a waste and a potentially characteristic hazardous waste, but if it meets the definition of a listing, then it also meets that listing. So it's not retroactive in the sense that let's say a contaminated solvent from degreasing is an F001 waste. A contaminated solvent from degreasing that was disposed of or released to the ground in 1979 is an F001 waste as it sits in the ground. But as soon as you actively manage it or pick it up, it becomes an F001 waste at that time, unless you contain it out first. And that's why the contained in principle is so important. And that's why it's such a useful tool, because it's a way to address pre-RCRA listed hazardous waste contamination. And the other thing I'll point out is there was reasons why EPA did this, and I talked about this in my last presentation. When EPA established the hazardous waste program, they had to think about the extent to which it was retroactive to activities that occurred before the law was in existence. Typically, some laws are retroactive in nature, and if you will, criminalize or illegalize things that occurred before the law was passed, but that's rare. So on the one hand, EPA didn't want the hazardous waste rules to apply retroactively to activities that occurred before RCRA was passed as a law and the regulations were written and promulgated. But on the other hand, they wanted to make sure that going forward, any newly generated waste was managed as a hazardous waste and subject to regulation. And any waste later on, any waste that was, as noted in this Federal Register that I mentioned, any waste that was generated as a waste after the effective date of RCRA would be properly managed at that time also, which was the reasoning behind the retroactivity for the listing. So, I think this is pretty clear. And again, I can redistribute the reference to the Federal Register notice that clarifies this, and we can send that out to everybody. But I really think there's no doubt on this issue. There are some fine points I think that can come up about certain particular scenarios that may be difficult to interpret. We already talked about issues where it may not be clear whether or not the source is listed or the timing of the release. That's certainly one of those issues. So that's what I wanted to chime in on.
Okay.
I also wanted to address the question about, well, actually, I'll just pause for a moment just to see if Mark or anyone else wants to comment on what I just said.
No, thank you for that, Ross. We can talk and send out a written clarification on that at a future date.
The other thing I was hoping to mention is that there was a question about when waste that's in an AOC is generated. And I didn't get into them in my presentation. I believe we'll get into it in the next presentation about on-site management of waste. But there's a rather complicated concept that EPA has talked about active management. I already alluded to it. There's two terms, active management and placement. And I won't get into it now, but essentially the answer to the question about waste generated within an AOC, or I shouldn't say that. The question about when waste that's within an AOC or contaminated environmental media within an AOC is generated as a waste depends on when it is actively managed. And active management can include lots of things, and it can include picking it up and putting it in a container within the AOC. It can include picking it up and taking it outside the AOC. It can be treating it ex situ within the AOC. Any number of these things would trigger the point of generation for waste in an AOC. So there's not a single bright line event that would cause a waste to be generated, cause a contaminated environmental media within an AOC to be generated as a waste. And I also wanted to touch quickly on the contained in policy in unauthorized states. I believe the person from Alaska is looking at the right document. And again, I can check on this. I don't have access to all the materials right now, but there was actually a few documents in which EPA set forth the criteria under which states could implement contained in policies. And they talked about the criteria that would have to be met for them to do that. And I'm working off of memory, but I do believe that it's correct that the few unauthorized states that there are out there, and I think that's Iowa, Alaska, and maybe some U.S. territories like Guam and Puerto Rico, I'm not sure. There's a very, very small portion of the 50 United States and its territories are not authorized under RCRA, and would therefore, if they wanted to have a contained in policy, they would that may have to defer to EPA. But again, I can check on that in the references that detail that, because I do have them.
When you said policy, Ross, you meant a determination. EPA would do the determination, right?
Yeah, it would be up to EPA to decide whether to make a contained in determination. Yes.
So I'm going to unmute Howard again because he had a bunch of other comments, and I thought since he could make them himself. Did you have more you wanted to add, Howard?
Not on this issue. I mean, I appreciate Mark's perspective. I just wanted to look for clarity on that. I'm more focused right now on how to develop the contained out criteria for a specific site. We have site-specific cleanup numbers, and that will dictate whether soil needs to be excavated or not. If it's above the cleanup level, it has to be managed off-site or has to be capped. Now, I was wondering if those would be appropriate for the basis for a contained out determination, where the ultimate disposal would be off-site. And my issue on that was just in reading the guidance, the H4 rule back in the 90s, where it was proposed and then removed, there was a discussion of something called contingent management as a basis for doing waste determinations. And the idea that you would do a waste determination based on how the waste would be managed was rejected. And so it was kind of left, ambiguous about how we apply risk numbers for doing contained out. you know, and if we can do a contained out by saying this media is going to be managed in a licensed subtitle D, let's say, because it will have a contained out, saving the generator and the, you know, the facility a lot of money for subtitle C disposal, that would be okay. I mean, it's at a place and it's going to be capped and it's going to be monitored and it won't get out into the broader environment. But I wasn't sure that we could base our contained out determination on where the media, you know, that needs to be managed ultimately would go, or whether we had to take a worst case scenario and do the contained out on something analogous to LDRs or residential cleanup standards, you know? So
Yeah,
that's kind of my bigger policy issue, honestly.
yeah. I think we, in terms of the contained out determination, it's one thing to make it consistent with different health-based standards based on where it's going, like, say, industrial commercial. But it's another thing to say, you could almost take any waste and say, well, if it's under a cap, it could be risked. You could do a risk assessment and try to say that it's no problem, but we wouldn't go that far. The idea of the, and please anybody else chime in on this, the idea of a contained out determination is that the levels are below health-based standards and it's not appropriate to consider this under RCRA anymore. And to me, if you're saying the only place that it's safe to be is under a cap that resembles a RCRA subtitle C cap, it seems like you really undermine the whole idea of the contained out determination to me. And I'd like to hear anyone else's opinion on that.
The only people unmuted right now are Ross and Howard.
Oh, Terry, I'd like to jump in if I could on this issue.
Okay. All right. Now, remember, we do have some more questions, so I want to get to those. So.
Yep. I'll just quickly note that in the guidance that EPA put together outlining how states could establish their contained-in policies, the guidance gives pretty liberal leeway to states to decide what the health-based criteria that they use are. Now, in Connecticut, we base our health-based criteria also off of our remediation standard regulation numbers, specifically direct exposure criteria and pollutant mobility criteria, but we don't make it those contained-in numbers contingent on the site, whether it's industrial, commercial, or residential. The numbers are the same. They're actually based off a multiple of the residential direct exposure criteria and pollutant mobility criteria, regardless of the site or where the soil might be going. So I guess what I would say is it's not so much of an issue of contingent management being employed as a concept. It's an issue as to whether or how a state employed health-based criteria to define when a material no longer contains illicit hazardous waste. And in Rhode Island's case, they did it in a way that I would agree looks like contingent management, but I'm not sure necessarily that EPA would disagree with it because it's based on their on health-based standards that they have determined.
But we wouldn't do it. I did want to emphasize we wouldn't do it to say, this is contained out if it's under a landfill cap. We wouldn't be that broad to say none of the remediation, basically it's above the remediation standard for industrial commercial, but it's okay because it's under a landfill cap. I think we wouldn't go that far.
Okay. Well, my particular problem is that my contamination is dioxin, and there's no real safe level for it. So I'm being very cautious about setting, any kind of precedent, or my team is. I'm just the attorney.
Yeah.
We do have a cleanup level for the site, but if the genie got out of the bottle, what is the safe basis for a contained out? And that's the policy issue we're struggling with for dioxin.
Yeah. That's a tough issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care.
So we do have a comment. I think it's a response to this whole conversation from Laura Castrilli, who is with EPA. She says, If you excavate media contaminated with a listed waste, the new point of generation is the excavation date, and the listing will apply even if you know the original spill predated the listing of the waste.
Okay.
Question from Robert.
Terry, could I just jump in and with it to put an asterisk on that statement?
Okay, go ahead.
I would agree with the statement from EPA with one exception. If the waste was disposed of or spilled or whatever, if the contamination resulted after the effective date of RCRA for the listing or the date of the characteristic that it was established, then it's already a waste in the ground.
And subject to corrective action.
And subject to all applicable RCRA requirements.
Including corrective action. So you may be required to do remediation, not just under the site mediation rules. You may be required, it might qualify as a RCRA corrective action site.
And the reason for that, obviously, is that EPA didn't want to create a perverse incentive to intentionally spill stuff after RCRA was established.
Okay, the next question comes from Robert Nakamoto. He asks, when determining the borders of the AOC, do you recommend allowing enough space to conduct treatment versus a very tight boundary? And I'm going to unmute Robert. Hopefully it'll work.
Okay. The area of contamination should be defined by where the contamination is. So if I was drawing my boundary because I wanted to include the area that I want to do the treatment in, the question is, the boundary should be drawn on where the contamination is. And there's some leeway for judgment here because where the contamination is depends on what you consider to be contaminated. However, the justification can't be because I want to treat it over here and therefore that's in the area of contamination. The justification needs to be that I've delineated the area of contamination and the area I want to treat it in is within that delineation.
So Robert, you're unmuted. Do you have anything to follow up on that?
No, that's a very good answer.
Okay. Thank you. The next question comes from Sean O'Brien. If I have a site that had a foundry on it in the early 1900s, would the lead and arsenic and other metals fall under RCRA if I want to excavate, stabilize, then dispose of off-site? Who wants to take that one?
So, if are you talking in terms of you're going to excavate it? As soon as you excavate, you're going to excavate it. You're going to characterize it. You characterize it that it contains regulated substances under RCRA. I would think so. Yeah.
Yes. Would the lead and arsenic and other metals fall under RCRA if I want to excavate, stabilize, then dispose of off-site? And Sean, I've unmuted you. So if you want to clarify this at all.
I haven't excavated anything at this point. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep.
And because I've just done soil test pits to determine what arsenic and lead levels are. So does it constitute being under RCRA at this point or not until after I excavate it?
Not until after you've excavated, because clearly the release didn't happen after 1990. So it's in the ground. You don't have to dig it up under RCRA, but when you dig it up, you have to characterize it.
Okay. So at that point, I would then have to worry about RCRA permits and such.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is Ross. I'll just jump in really quickly, and we'll talk about this more in the next, in the series, number 3 in the series about on-site management.
Right.
But yes, it gets back to this issue that I talked about earlier about active management.
Yeah.
So if you have a waste, if you have contamination from the spill or disposal of a waste that's pre-RCRA, and arsenic and lead are both things that were regulated beginning in November 19th, 1980.
Yep.
So if it's pre-November 19th, 1980, as it sits in the ground, it's not a hazardous waste. But as soon as you quote unquote actively manage it, which can include picking it up, taking it outside the AOC, managing it in above ground equipment to treat it in and or outside of an AOC, or anything like, any of another of other things other than normal soil movement around within the AOC.
Yeah.
Then it will be generated at that point and become subject to RCRA at that point, as if presuming it exceeds TCLP criteria for arsenic or lead as a characteristically hazardous waste.
All right.
And the key point is that you want to decide ahead of time where your AOC is and how it'll be managed before you dig it up, because once you dig it up and actively manage it, all the standards apply.
Yes.
Okay, Ross or Kevin, do you know the answer to what the date is considered generated if your soil is stockpiled within the AOC? This comes from Tamara again.
Yeah, okay, so it gets back to the answer that I mentioned before. Quote unquote normal soil moving activities within the AOC, and that can include pushing it into a pile within the AOC, is not active management. It doesn't result in the generation of the waste. So it kind of depends on the first thing that does happen to that pile that constitutes active management. So if that pile is picked up by a backhoe and put into a dumpster, that would be active management. It would be generated at that point. If it's treated ex situ, for example, in a pug mill, that would be active management. That would be the point of generation. So it kind of depends on what happens to it next. Basically, which includes basically other than just having it in the pile and inside the AOC.
Okay, we don't have much time left, and this is a rather long question, but I'll try to get to it. It's from Michael Summerlin. Regarding soils remaining in the area of contamination, when drilling and creating waste soil cuttings that would otherwise be considered a listed hazardous waste are placed on maybe polypropylene or something, within the area of contamination, would the active placement on poly be considered active management such that the soil cuttings would be considered generated? I understand that placement of the soil cuttings into a roll-off box, even within the AOC, would cause them to be, quote, generated, but is the same true of using poly?
I would say yes. Ross, do you want to chime in on that?
That's kind of a tricky and I think site-specific one, because it kind of depends what the AOC is. So, for example, it's possible that you could be in an uncontaminated area drilling down into a plume below the uncontaminated area, and you're not actually in the AOC. That's actually kind of controversial. I wouldn't pursue that one very far, but it can depend somewhat on what the circumstances are and also what ultimately happens to that material. I mean, if that material is going to be disposed of, I think that could be potentially a factor. But I guess I would ask, why are you putting it on poly in the first place if it's within the AOC? But I guess I would need to know more. I would need to know more about what was actually happening and why it was happening and what ultimately happened to the soil.
What makes it tricky is trying to manage it within the area of contamination before you've actually delineated the area of contamination.
That's kind of what I was getting at, yeah. And what we advise people to do to avoid these kinds of questions and these problems is just have a drum nearby, put the drill cuttings or the monitoring well bailings into the drum, and if it's early along in the site investigation and you don't know if it's hazardous or not, just mark it hazardous pending analysis and manage it as such until you get the results back. And if it's hazardous, dispose of it as such. That's what we recommend people do to avoid these kinds of questions and problems.
I would second that. You should containerize it and mark it as hazardous pending determination. Because you're at a stage where you really don't know, you really haven't even defined your area of contamination, so it's hard to argue that you're within an area that you don't know where the area is. And if it's not
All right,
hazardous,
I think
it's not
we're
hazardous.
out of, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mark. Finish your thought.
If it's not hazardous, then it's not hazardous. You do your analysis, not hazardous, fine, you can treat it differently. But I would, as Ross said, containerize it and treat it as if it were hazardous because you don't have the results back yet. If you're at that stage where you don't know.
Okay, I think we're out of time, guys. We do have one or two more questions. The person who asked that question let me know that he doesn't have a microphone, so I can't follow up with him. So I think we're going to thank both Mark for sure and Ross for chiming in there and clarifying some of these questions. I want to let folks who are still on the webinar know that our next webinar in this series will take place Friday, January 24th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's a little friendlier for our friends in Alaska. And the topic will be RCRA compliance at cleanup sites, on-site management of remediation waste. So it sort of continues some of the kinds of conversations we're having today a little bit, takes it to the next topic. We are going to have Ross Bunnell speak again. He's from Connecticut Deep, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We're going to have Martin Sanchez from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, also joining Ross to make that presentation. So thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Lots of great questions, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.